How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AITA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Snow pressed hard against the windshield, thick and relentless, blurring the city into a wash of white and red brake lights. Jessica Whitman sat behind the wheel of her taxi, hands steady at 10 and 2, easing the car forward a few feet at a time. Cleveland was locked in a full standstill. A winter storm had swallowed the afternoon, and traffic crawled like a living thing that had grown tired of moving. The radio murmured low, a familiar voice she barely registered. Jessica kept her eyes on the road, breathing evenly, her expression calm, almost detached. Inside the cab, everything was quiet and contained. Outside, horns flared and engines groaned, drivers gesturing through fog glass. The contrast felt strange, but familiar. Jessica had learned to keep her world small. The seat beneath her, the hum of the engine, the measured rhythm of her own thoughts. She checked the app, hoping the next fare wouldn't cancel. Long waits came with the territory now. She accepted that, just as she accepted most things these days. This was her life. A taxi driver navigating snowbound streets, counting hours instead of profits, measuring days by mileage rather than milestones. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the one she lived with discipline and restraint. There was a certain control in it, a beginning and an end to every shift. No meetings, no promises, just the road. As the car idled, her thoughts drifted backward, pulled by the quiet. Not long ago, everything had been different. Jessica had once been known across the city as a rising business owner. What started as a single hair salon had grown into a small but successful chain, each location busy, modern, and profitable. She had an eye for talent, an instinct for trends, and a work ethic that impressed even her competitors. Her days were full then, not with waiting, but with planning, expansion, hiring, numbers that climbed steadily upward. She remembered the satisfaction of opening a new location, the scent of fresh paint, the buzz of possibility. At home, her life had seemed just as solid. She had been married to Eric Whitman for nearly 4 years, and from the outside, they looked effortless together. Eric worked in land development, a field that paid well and demanded confidence. He was articulate, driven, and charming when he chose to be. Together, they hosted dinners, attended events, laughed easily in public. Friends admired them. Colleagues envied them. More than once, Jessica had heard people say they were a perfect match. She believed it too. For a time, their social circle treated them as a unit, inseparable and balanced. Jessica, the ambitious entrepreneur. Eric, the steady provider with connections and vision. They fit neatly into the picture everyone expected. Even Jessica's own doubts, when they surfaced, were quiet and fleeting. She was busy. He was busy. That was adulthood, she told herself. That was success. But beneath the polished surface, small fractures had begun to form. Eric started coming home later. At first, he explained it away with deadlines and meetings that ran long. Jessica accepted those explanations easily. She understood pressure. She understood ambition. Still, something in his absence felt different. Phone calls grew shorter. Conversations thinned. When he was home, he often retreated into his office, a glass of whiskey in hand, the door closed. Jessica noticed the change before she admitted it. His laughter didn't reach his eyes anymore. His questions about her day sounded rehearsed, polite rather than curious. There were nights when he sat across from her at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely touching his food. When she tried to bridge the distance, he brushed it off with tired smiles and vague reassurances. She told herself not to overthink it. Successful lives came with strain. Relationships required patience. She doubled down on her efforts, working harder, planning more, believing that stability was something you could maintain if you tried hard enough. Yet The unease lingered. It settled quietly, like snow accumulating on a roof. Unnoticed until the weight became too heavy. Jessica felt it in the silences, in the way Eric avoided her gaze, in the faint smell of alcohol when he kissed her goodnight. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to make her uneasy. The taxi lurched forward another car length. Jessica's hands tightened slightly on the wheel before relaxing again. Outside, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Inside, she remained composed, her face revealing little of the past she carried. Back then, she had believed her life was secure, built carefully, earned honestly. She had trusted that what she created, both in business and in marriage, rested on solid ground. She hadn't known how fragile that ground truly was. The discovery happened by accident in the most ordinary way. Jessica wasn't searching for anything. She had stepped into the bedroom to grab her phone charger while Eric was in the shower, steam fogging the bathroom mirror down the hall. His laptop sat open on the edge of the bed, the screen glowing softly in the dim light. At first, she barely glanced at it. Then a notification appeared. A name she didn't recognize. A preview line that stopped her mid-step. Jessica moved closer, a faint unease tightening in her chest. The screen was unlocked. A message thread filled the display. Scrolling upward with a flick of her fingers she didn't remember deciding to make. The words blurred together at first, then sharpened with brutal clarity. Intimate jokes, familiar endearments, promises that didn't belong to her. Photos followed, explicit ones, carefully taken, deliberately sent. A young woman posed with confidence, looking directly into the camera as if she knew exactly who would be on the other side of the screen. There was nothing accidental about any of it. For a moment, Jessica simply stood there, the laptop balanced in her hands, her thoughts suspended in a hollow silence. Her heartbeat thudded loudly in her ears. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a client. It wasn't a joke taken out of context. The messages stretched back weeks, even months, threaded with a familiarity that left no room for doubt. She heard the shower shut off. When Eric walked into the bedroom, towel draped loosely around his waist, she was still standing there, the laptop open between them. He froze when he saw her expression. The flicker of surprise in his eyes lasted only a second before something else replaced it. "What is this?" Jessica asked quietly. Her voice didn't shake, though she felt as if the floor beneath her had shifted. "Don't tell me this is work. I won't believe it." Eric exhaled slowly, irritation crossing his face as if she had inconvenienced him. "Since when do you go through my things?" he snapped. "Who gave you permission to touch my laptop?" She stared at him, waiting for denial, an apology, anything that resembled regret. None came. "I wasn't looking for anything," she said. "But you didn't even try to hide it. Who is she?" He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Natalie Cross. And don't make this bigger than it needs to be." Bigger. The word felt foreign on her tongue. "You're cheating on me." Eric's expression hardened. He didn't look ashamed. If anything, he looked relieved. "If you want to call it that, fine. But don't pretend this came out of nowhere. Things like this happen." "Do they?" Jessica asked. "Or did you just decide they should?" He shrugged, turning away to pull on a shirt. "Love isn't what you think it is. Not anymore. People stay together because it's convenient, because it works. Natalie understands that. She doesn't ask for more. So I'm inconvenient," Jessica said. Eric met her gaze then, and the contempt in his eyes was unmistakable. "You've been busy building your little empire. I needed something different, something simpler." The words struck harder than any raised voice could have. Natalie wasn't a mistake. She wasn't a moment of weakness. She was a choice, calculated, repeated, justified. "And you love her?" Jessica asked, though she already sensed the answer wouldn't soften the blow. Eric scoffed. Love? That's a nice story people tell themselves. Natalie and I work. That's all that matters. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. Jessica closed the laptop with deliberate care and set it back on the bed, as if doing so could restore some order to the moment. Her hands trembled despite her effort to control them. Without another word, she picked up her bag from the chair by the door. Eric watched her, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Somewhere I can breathe," she replied. She walked out of the house without looking back, the door closing softly behind her. The sound echoed through the hallway, final and unmistakable. Outside, the cold air hit her like a shock. Jessica stood on the front steps for a moment, her breath visible in the night, her mind racing to keep up with what had just shattered. Shock gave way to humiliation, humiliation to a raw, tearing pain she couldn't yet name. Everything she thought she understood about her marriage had collapsed in a single evening, and as she stepped into the darkness, the rupture spread, splitting her life cleanly down the middle, beyond anything she could repair. Jessica did not tell anyone about the pregnancy at first. She carried the knowledge quietly, as if speaking it aloud might make it fragile. The symptoms had crept in subtly over weeks. Morning nausea she blamed on stress. Dizziness she attributed to exhaustion. Still, something felt different enough that she scheduled an appointment, more out of caution than expectation. The confirmation came quickly, 3 months along. The doctor's tone was warm, almost cheerful, as he explained the timeline and routine next steps. Jessica nodded, listening, her mind already racing ahead. She left the clinic with a folded printout in her purse and a careful smile on her face. She had imagined the moment she would tell Eric, rehearsed it in her head during the drive home. That evening, she thought, would be the beginning of a new chapter, a reason to pause, to reconnect. Instead, that same evening unraveled everything she believed she knew. After leaving the house in shock, Jessica checked into a small hotel not far from downtown. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the wall, replaying Eric's words until they lost their meaning. At some point, the emotional pain gave way to a sharper sensation, low in her abdomen. At first, she ignored it. Then the cramps intensified, deep and insistent. When she stood to get a glass of water, dizziness washed over her. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her clothes. Panic followed instinct. Jessica called 911 with shaking hands, her voice strained as she tried to explain what was happening. The operator stayed on the line until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics moved quickly, efficiently, asking questions she struggled to answer as they guided her onto a stretcher. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments of flashing lights and muffled voices. In the emergency room, doctors and nurses surrounded her, cutting away fabric, attaching monitors, working with urgent focus. The bleeding worsened. Jessica drifted in and out of awareness, clinging to the sound of her own breathing. She woke hours later in the intensive care unit, her body heavy and weak. Machines humming steadily beside her. A doctor stood at the foot of the bed, his expression careful and professional. They had stopped the bleeding. They had stabilized her. But the pregnancy was gone. "I'm very sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "There was no other choice. Your life was at risk." Jessica stared at the ceiling, absorbing the words without reaction. The doctor explained further, medical necessity, rapid intervention, the priority of saving her life. But the explanations slid past her. All she could think was that she had lost something she hadn't even had the chance to share. The hospital notified Eric as required. Jessica did not ask them to. She did not have the strength to object. He arrived the next day, carrying a large bouquet of flowers and a bag of fruit from a nearby store. He looked uncomfortable standing beside her bed, as if the sterile room unsettled him. They exchanged a few obligatory words. He did not mention the pregnancy. He did not mention the night before. "I'll have my lawyer send the divorce papers by email," he said eventually, glancing at his phone. "We can finalize things once you're discharged." Jessica said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on a point behind him, somewhere far beyond the hospital walls. Eric hesitated, then reached out, placing his hand briefly over hers. She pulled away at once, the movement small but decisive. "This is for the best," he added, his voice firm, almost reassuring. "Everything points to it." He left shortly after, the flowers untouched. Recovery took weeks. Jessica underwent intensive monitoring, physical therapy, and follow-up appointments. The doctors spoke carefully about future fertility, using words like uncertain and possible complications. Each sentence felt like another door closing. When she was finally discharged, the divorce process was already underway. Eric had hired an aggressive legal team. Contracts and accounts Jessica had once signed without hesitation, out of trust, out of partnership, now worked against her. Properties were listed under Eric's name. Business assets had been transferred in ways she had never questioned. In court, the outcome was swift and clinical. Eric retained most of the wealth, the businesses, the investments. Jessica walked away with little more than personal belongings and a modest settlement that barely reflected the life she had built. She did not argue. She did not fight. The energy for resistance had drained out of her somewhere between the ICU and the courtroom. Grief settled in layers. First for the child she had lost. Then for the marriage she realized had already ended long before she discovered the truth. Finally for herself, and the version of her life that no longer existed. By the time the divorce was finalized, Jessica felt strangely empty. The pain dulled, replaced by a numb acceptance. She packed what remained of her life into boxes and closed the door behind her without ceremony. Nothing was left to salvage. Only the quiet understanding that everything she once believed was secure had vanished, leaving her standing alone in the aftermath, unsure of what feeling would come next. Jessica left her old neighborhood without announcement or ceremony. She chose a small studio apartment on the far edge of the city, a place most people passed without noticing. The building was older, the hallways narrow, the windows overlooking a stretch of road that rarely slept. It was far enough from her former life that chance encounters felt unlikely, yet close enough to the city that she wouldn't feel entirely erased. The apartment was sparsely furnished. A bed, a table, 2 chairs. Jessica unpacked slowly, methodically, placing each item with care. There were no photographs on the walls, no reminders of what had been. She told herself that this was temporary, though she didn't yet know what she was waiting for. A few days later, she walked into a small neighborhood salon and asked the stylist to cut her hair short. When the first locks fell to the floor, she felt a strange sense of relief. The long, light hair she had worn for years disappeared piece by piece, replaced by a sharper, darker style. She chose a deep brown shade, almost black, and watched her reflection change in the mirror until it no longer matched the woman she remembered. The stylist paused, studying her face. "You look like a different person," she said. "That's the point," Jessica replied quietly. The transformation wasn't only physical. She traded tailored coats for practical jackets, muted colors for darker tones. Large sunglasses hid her eyes when she walked through the city. With each deliberate change, she felt herself shedding an identity that had become too heavy to carry. For the first time since the divorce, she allowed herself to consider what came next. Returning to business felt impossible. Too many memories, too many names tied to her former life. She needed something simpler, something that belonged only to her. Driving had always been that thing. As a teenager, she had loved being behind the wheel. Her father had taught her early, patiently, trusting her instincts long before she trusted herself. Even during her marriage, She had preferred driving herself rather than relying on anyone else. On the road, she felt focused, in control. The idea took hold quietly, then solidified. Jessica applied to a local taxi company, filling out the forms without hesitation. When she arrived for the interview, the owner, Frank Dalton, looked her over skeptically. He was a broad man with a permanently tired expression, accustomed to saying no. "Long hours," he said bluntly. "Bad weather. Not exactly easy work." "I know," Jessica replied. He glanced at her application, unimpressed. "We don't usually hire women without experience in the field." "I have experience driving," she said calmly. "More than enough." Frank sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I'll tell you what. Take the car for a test drive. We'll see." Jessica didn't waste the opportunity. She drove with confidence, navigating narrow streets, reacting smoothly to sudden stops, handling the vehicle as if it were an extension of herself. By the time she returned, Frank's expression had shifted, if only slightly. "You'll do," he muttered. "We're short-staffed, anyway." The work was demanding. Long shifts, late nights, early mornings. Jessica welcomed the exhaustion. It left little room for memories. She learned the city in a new way, street by street, passenger by passenger. Most days, she spoke only when necessary, offering polite responses, keeping her thoughts to herself. Other drivers noticed her competence and left her alone. She didn't linger after shifts or join conversations in the break room. She showed up on time, drove well, and went home. The collapse of her former life had stripped her down to essentials. What remained was a quiet determination. She wasn't rebuilding yet. She was surviving. And for now, that was enough. The request came through just as the traffic began to loosen. Jessica glanced at the screen mounted near the dashboard, then confirmed the pickup without hesitation. The address belonged to a luxury apartment complex on the north side of the city, the kind with heated garages and uniformed security. She adjusted her mirrors and followed the navigation, unaware that this ride would fracture the fragile balance she had built. She pulled up beneath a covered entrance, dusted with snow. The building rose above her, glass and steel reflecting the storm in muted tones. Jessica parked and waited, hands resting lightly on the wheel, her face composed. The rear door opened. She recognized the voice before she turned her head. "Let's go. We're already late." Her breath caught for just a fraction of a second. Eric Whitman slid into the back seat, shrugging off his coat. Beside him, Natalie Cross followed, her laughter sharp and unrestrained as she brushed snow from her sleeve. They settled in comfortably, as if the car were merely another extension of their world. Jessica kept her eyes forward. The dark hair, the sunglasses, the lowered cap, none of it betrayed her. She watched them briefly through the rearview mirror, her heart pounding as recognition slammed into her with brutal force. Eric did not look twice the driver. Natalie didn't glance at her at all. "Music's too loud," Eric said. "Turn it down." Jessica nodded once and adjusted the volume, her movements precise. She pulled away from the curb, smoothly, the car merging into traffic as if nothing had changed. The silence that followed felt heavy, taut with unspoken tension. Jessica focused on the road, but every word behind her cut through the quiet with surgical clarity. "We don't have much time before the annual bid review," Eric said, lowering his voice. "If Calder delivers on his end, we'll lock in 60% of the deal." Natalie let out a soft laugh. 60? That's more than enough, especially once the paperwork disappears. Jessica's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "You made sure the payments were routed properly?" Natalie asked. "Of course," Eric replied. "Nothing ties back directly. Ray Owl Calder doesn't get involved unless everything's airtight." The name echoed in Jessica's mind. She had heard it before, whispered in business circles she once moved through. Calder wasn't just a financier. He was a shadow, known for making problems vanish and deals go through, no matter the cost. Natalie leaned closer to Eric, her voice dropping further. And the other bidders? They'll fight, Eric said dismissively. They always do. But they don't have what we have. Once the files surface, they won't even make it past the first review. Jessica swallowed. The implications were unmistakable. This wasn't ambition. It was fraud, bribery, carefully engineered corruption, spoken about as casually as dinner plans. Her chest tightened, a surge of heat flooding her veins. She forced herself to breathe, to keep the car steady as the words continued to spill from the back seat. Each sentence peeled away another layer of the man she had once trusted, revealing something colder and more calculated beneath. A horn blared suddenly as traffic ahead slowed without warning. Jessica reacted a beat too late, her thoughts splintering under the weight of what she was hearing. The taxi swerved slightly, tires skidding over packed snow. "Hey!" Natalie shouted, grabbing the seat. "Watch the road!" Jessica corrected instantly, bringing the car back under control. A large truck thundered past in the opposite lane, missing them by a narrow margin. Her pulse roared in her ears. "Are you asleep up there?" Eric snapped. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "I'm sorry," Jessica said, lowering her voice deliberately. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to turn around. The glare from the snow caught me off guard. Natalie scoffed. Unbelievable. They really hire anyone these days. Jessica let the insult pass without reaction. She welcomed it in a way. It reminded her why silence was necessary. As Natalie shifted in her seat, something small slipped from her purse and clattered softly onto the floor. Neither of them noticed. Jessica did. She glimpsed it in the mirror. A small metallic object, catching the light briefly before disappearing beneath the seat. The rest of the drive passed in tense quiet. Eric muttered complaints. Natalie checked her phone, her earlier amusement gone. When Jessica pulled up at their destination, Eric threw the door open without a word. "Don't expect a tip," he said flatly as he stepped out. Natalie followed, adjusting her coat, still unaware of what she had lost. Jessica waited until they were gone before she allowed herself to exhale. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached down and retrieved the object from the floor. A USB drive. She stared at it for a long moment, the storm outside pressing against the windows as realization settled in. Shock gave way to rage, sharp and consuming. Then, beneath it all, something else emerged, clear, focused, and dangerous. For the first time since her life had collapsed, Jessica understood that this ride had changed everything. Jessica didn't return to the taxi stand right away. She drove aimlessly for several minutes, the USB resting in the cup holder like a small, dangerous weight. When she finally stopped at a red light, she picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. It was unmarked except for a faint metallic pattern along the casing, subtle enough to escape notice, deliberate enough to suggest importance. Back in her apartment that night, she pulled out the compact laptop she kept tucked away for emergencies. She inserted the USB and waited. The system recognized the device immediately, but when she tried to open it, a password prompt appeared on the screen. She tried a few obvious combinations, then stopped. This wasn't something meant to be accessed casually. The encryption was professional. Whatever was on the drive, its owners had expected scrutiny. Jessica removed the USB and sat back, staring at the blank wall across from her. She could leave it there, forget it existed. The thought lasted only seconds. After what she had heard in the car, ignorance was no longer an option. She decided to head back toward the taxi company, planning to think through her next steps on the drive. Less than 10 minutes later, the car jolted violently to one side. The steering wheel pulled hard against her hands. Jessica managed to slow and guide the taxi onto the shoulder before it came to a complete stop. She stepped out into the cold and walked around to the rear of the vehicle. The left tire was completely flat, shredded along the edge. She exhaled sharply. There was no spare in the trunk. She had complained about it more than once, only to be dismissed, with no better option. She searched her phone and found a small auto repair shop, still open a few blocks away. She drove slowly on the damaged tire, the rhythmic thump echoing her irritation. The garage was modest, brightly lit against the dark street. A young man looked up from beneath the hood of a car as she pulled in. He wiped his hands on a rag and approached calmly, his movements unhurried. "Looks like you didn't just hit a nail," he said after a quick glance. "I can fix it. Won't take long." Jessica nodded, grateful. "Thank you." His name was Evan Monroe. He worked efficiently, explaining little unless asked, his focus steady. As he replaced the tire, Jessica noticed how comfortable he seemed around the machinery, how naturally he handled tools most people treated with caution. When he finished, she paid him and hesitated, the USB pressing against her palm inside her coat pocket. On impulse, she pulled it out. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Do you know anything about encrypted storage?" Evan paused, studying the device with a flicker of interest. "Depends on the encryption," he replied carefully. She explained only that the drive was locked and that she needed to access its contents. She did not mention where it came from. He considered for a moment, then nodded. "I can take a look," he said. "No guarantees." She left the USB with him and returned to her routine. The next few days, stretching longer than usual. Part of her hoped he would call and tell her it was impossible. Another part dreaded what success might mean. When her phone finally rang, Evan's voice sounded different, more alert. "I managed to get into part of it," he said. "You should come see this." They met at a quiet cafe near the garage. Evan brought his laptop, opening it carefully once they were seated. He showed her folders filled with documents, images, and short video clips. Even without understanding every detail, Jessica could tell immediately that this was serious. Contracts, payment records, footage that looked like private meetings recorded without consent. "This isn't personal data," Evan said quietly. "This is leverage." Jessica felt a chill settle in her chest. The fragments matched what she had overheard. Evidence of wrongdoing, of powerful people operating beyond the law. "Is that everything?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, there's more. The rest is locked behind another layer. Whoever built this didn't want it cracked easily." As they talked, Jessica became aware of Evan's careful phrasing, the way he avoided certain questions. He didn't ask where the USB came from. He didn't speculate about names. He watched her closely, as if measuring how much to reveal. Despite that, a quiet trust began to form. He didn't pressure her. He didn't suggest selling the data or turning it over hastily. He treated the situation with restraint, almost respect. Still, something about him felt guarded. When she asked casual questions about his background, he answered briefly, redirecting the conversation back to technical matters. It wasn't evasive exactly, just selective. Hope stirred, fragile, cautious alongside suspicion. Jessica sensed that Evan Monroe knew more than he was saying, that his interest in the USB went beyond curiosity. Yet she also felt, instinctively, that he wasn't her enemy. As she left the cafe, the city humming around her, Jessica realized she had taken another step she couldn't undo. The USB had led her to a man who knew too much, and for the first time since the ride that changed everything, she wasn't facing it entirely alone. Jessica did not confront Evan right away. Instead, she did what she had learned to do after losing everything. She observed, listened, and verified. Quietly, methodically, she reached out to old contacts she hadn't spoken to since her former life, people who still moved through the edges of Cleveland's business world. She asked neutral questions. She checked public records. She followed threads that seemed unrelated until they began to converge. That was how the name surfaced. Victor Monroe. The same Victor Monroe whose company dominated construction bids across northern Ohio. The same Victor Monroe whose name appeared in city council meeting minutes, zoning approvals, and development plans that reshaped entire neighborhoods. And the same Victor Monroe whose personal life rarely made the news, except for the occasional mention of a gifted, promising son who had disappeared from the public eye. Evan Monroe. The realization settled heavily in Jessica's chest. It explained the careful restraint in his words, the precision with which he handled the USB, the way he seemed both familiar and distant from the power it represented. She waited until their next meeting to acknowledge what she now knew. They sat in Evan's small apartment above the garage, the city lights flickering faintly through the window. The USB lay on the table between them, silent and ominous. "I know who your father is," Jessica said calmly. Evan's shoulders stiffened. For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled a long, controlled breath and nodded. "I wonder how long it would take," he replied. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He simply sat back and folded his hands together as if bracing himself. "I left a year ago," he said. "Cut ties. Changed my name at work. I didn't want anything from him anymore." "Why?" Jessica asked. Evan looked toward the window. "Because I couldn't pretend not to see what he was doing. Because I didn't want to be part of it." He told her about the project, plans to tear down one of the city's last remaining public parks to make room for a private residential complex. The proposal had sparked protests, petitions, public hearings that went nowhere. Money spoke louder than voices. Victor Monroe had connections that reached far beyond city limits. "I tried to stop it," Evan said. "I argued. I showed him the impact reports, the environmental damage, the people who relied on that space. He called it sentimentality. Said progress always makes enemies." Jessica listened without interrupting. She recognized the tone, the same cold certainty she had once heard in Eric's voice. "When I realized he wasn't going to stop," Evan continued, "I left. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his name. I wanted a clean break." The room fell silent. That night, Evan finished decrypting the USB. They watched the footage together, the glow of the screen casting harsh light across their faces. Video clips showed Victor Monroe seated at private tables, passing envelopes, shaking hands with men whose positions were unmistakable. There were timestamps, financial transfers, recorded conversations, stripped of context but rich with implication. Bribes, guarantees, favors exchanged with practiced ease. Evan stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. This wasn't rumor. It wasn't suspicion. It was proof. I was afraid of this," he said quietly. "Jessica, close the laptop. Now you know." He nodded. "Now I have to choose." The weight of that choice filled the room. Exposing the evidence would destroy Victor Monroe's career, his legacy, and possibly send him to prison. It would also halt the project, protect the park, and bring down others entangled in the scheme. Remaining silent would preserve blood ties at the cost of complicity. Evan pressed his palms together, fingers interlaced. "He's still my father." Jessica met his gaze, her expression steady. "And this is still the truth." He looked at her then, searching for judgment, for pressure, for direction. He found none. "I won't push you," she said. "This isn't my decision to make." "You don't think it's already made?" he asked. "I think rushing it would be a mistake," Jessica replied. "I've learned that acting too quickly without protecting yourself only creates more damage." Evan absorbed her words slowly. He had expected anger, urgency, even manipulation. What he found instead was restraint, control, strength tempered by experience. The power of the evidence did not lie in immediate exposure. It lay in understanding when and how to use it. As the night wore on, Neither of them spoke much. The USB remained on the table, its presence undeniable. Between them stretched a fragile alliance, built not on trust alone, but on shared understanding of loss, betrayal, and consequence. For Jessica, the revelation had clarified something fundamental. The truth was no longer just a weapon against Eric. It was a force with far-reaching impact, capable of destroying and saving in equal measure. And for the first time since the collapse of her life, she felt not driven by rage, but guided by something colder and more controlled. Power, she had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it waited. Jessica sensed the shift before it was confirmed. The atmosphere at the taxi company changed subtly, like pressure building before a storm. Drivers spoke in lower voices. Conversations stopped when supervisors walked past. When Frank Dalton summoned her to his office, she already knew something was wrong. Frank sat behind his desk, hands folded, watching her too closely. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I decided to upgrade security a while ago. Every cab's got cameras now. Front and back. Audio too." Jessica felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression neutral. "That's not what the paperwork says." Frank smiled thinly. "Paperwork doesn't cover everything." He tapped his phone, then turned the screen toward her. A paused video frame filled the display. Her taxi, the back seat, Eric Whitman and Natalie Cross mid-conversation. The angle was unmistakable. "I know about the USB," Frank continued casually. "I know you picked it up. I know you didn't report it." Jessica said nothing. "Here's how this works," he went on. "You keep quiet. You hand over a month's wages. And I don't forward this footage to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions." The demand was calculated, not desperate. Frank believed he had leverage. He believed he was in control. Jessica nodded slowly. "Fine." Her lack of resistance surprised him. He studied her for a moment, then waved her off, already imagining what else he could extract later. As she left the office, Jessica understood two things clearly. Frank Dalton was greedy enough to sell anyone out, and Eric Whitman was closer than she had realized. That understanding became reality 2 nights later. The pounding on her apartment door came just after midnight. Loud, insistent, angry. "Open up, Jessica. I know you're in there." Her blood ran cold at the sound of Eric's voice. She approached the door cautiously, every instinct screaming warning. When she opened it, Eric pushed past her without waiting for permission. His eyes swept the room, wild and sharp, his jaw clenched with barely restrained fury. "Where is it?" he demanded. "The USB. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Jessica stepped back, forcing herself to remain calm. "I don't have anything of yours." Eric laughed, short and harsh. "Don't insult me. Dalton sold you out. You think you're smarter than everyone else." He moved closer, crowding her space, his presence aggressive and unsteady. For a moment, Jessica feared he might strike her. The man standing in her apartment no longer resembled the husband she once knew. This version was volatile, driven by panic and entitlement. "I want it," he said. "Now, or things get ugly." Jessica held his gaze. Fear surged through her, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it was calculation. She had prepared for this moment. Without a word, she walked to the small table by the window and retrieved the USB from a drawer. She turned it over in her hand once, then tossed it toward him. It landed on the couch with a soft thud. "That's it," she said evenly. "You win. Just get out." Eric snatched it up, relief flashing across his face before morphing into smug satisfaction. He didn't even check the contents. He never had been the careful type. He believed what he wanted to believe. "Smart move," he said. "You were never cut out for this." He left as abruptly as he had arrived. the door slamming behind him. Jessica sank onto the chair, her legs trembling now that the danger had passed. She waited, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway, counting each second until she was sure he was gone. Only then did she reach into her coat pocket and remove a second USB. The original. She stared at it, the small device warm from the heat of her body. Eric had taken the manipulated version, stripped of names, altered just enough to appear intact while rendering it useless. He would discover the truth eventually, but by then it would be too late. Jessica leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. The fear was still there, lingering in her chest, but it no longer ruled her. She had surrendered only on the surface. Control, she understood now, didn't always belong to the one who shouted the loudest or demanded the most. Sometimes it belonged to the person willing to give up a piece to protect the whole. Eric believed he had one. Jessica knew better, and in that quiet certainty she felt the balance shift once again, away from him and firmly back into her hands. Eric realized something was wrong the moment he opened the files. He had waited until late, alone in his home office, confident and unhurried. The USB slid into his laptop with a familiar click. For a few seconds, the folders looked exactly as he remembered, structured, labeled, reassuring. Then he began opening them. The videos were wrong. Where there should have been private meetings, there were harmless clips. Where names of officials and developers once appeared, there were placeholders, altered references, entire threads stripped of meaning. Eric refreshed the screen, cursed under his breath, tried again. The realization crept in slowly, then hit with full force. The data had been compromised. "What did you do?" Natalie demanded when he told her, her voice sharp with panic. "We can't go to the city like this." Eric slammed the laptop shut. "She played us." The confidence he had carried out of Jessica's apartment evaporated. He made calls, too many, too fast. Each conversation confirmed what he feared. Ray, Owl, Calder was no longer patient. The investors were nervous. The people who had paid to keep their names buried were asking questions. Pressure closed in from all sides. And then the threats began. Jessica noticed the change immediately. Cars followed her through side streets. Large SUVs cut too close in traffic, forcing her to brake hard with passengers in the back seat. Once, a man approached her cab at a stoplight, staring too long before stepping away without a word. She didn't need confirmation to understand what it meant. Eric had realized she still held power, and he was desperate enough to eliminate the risk. She stopped driving passengers and went into hiding for several days, staying with Evan in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. They spoke little, conserving energy, listening to the silence between distant sirens and passing traffic. "They won't stop," Evan said finally. "Not unless they think you're gone." Jessica understood the implication immediately. The plan formed with chilling clarity. It was dangerous, extreme, but it was the only move left. Death would give her what life no longer could: distance. They chose an old sedan that had once belonged to Jessica's father, kept and used in a garage for years. It was unremarkable, easy to trace, easy to explain. On a stormy night, the car was driven out of the city toward a remote stretch of highway. Evan made sure the timing aligned with traffic cameras and emergency response patterns. The crash was staged carefully. The vehicle left the road, struck an embankment, and caught fire after fuel leaked onto hot metal. By the time first responders arrived, the car was engulfed in flames. There was nothing to save. The next morning, the news broke. Local outlets reported the death of a taxi driver in a single-car accident during severe winter conditions. The name, Jessica Whitman, appeared briefly on the screen, accompanied by grainy footage of the burned-out wreck. Investigators cited icy roads and mechanical failure. No foul play suspected. Eric watched the report in silence. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled, slow and relieved. "She's gone," he said. "It's over." Natalie nodded, though unease flickered in her eyes. They packed quickly. Passports. Cash. One-way tickets booked under pressure. The city had become hostile ground. 3 weeks later, everything unraveled. A press conference was announced unexpectedly. Victor Monroe appeared on screen, seated behind a simple podium, his expression grave. The room was filled with reporters. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone. "I am here to take responsibility," he said, "for my actions and for the harm they have caused." He admitted to bribery, to manipulating bids, to abusing influence. He confirmed the existence of evidence and acknowledged its authenticity. He announced his immediate withdrawal from the development project and pledged full cooperation with investigators. The reaction was explosive. Headlines spread across the city within hours. Public outrage followed. The park project was halted indefinitely. Officials named in the investigation scrambled to respond. Others resigned before they could be questioned. Eric saw the announcement while sitting in an airport lounge. Natalie beside him, bags packed at their feet. His phone rang once. Then again. By the time security approached, he already knew. They were escorted away from the gate in full view of other passengers. Natalie protested. Eric said nothing. Federal agents placed them under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. Jessica watched the footage days later from a small, quiet room miles away. She sat still, her face unreadable as Eric's image filled the screen. Stripped of confidence, reduced to panic. Justice did not arrive with celebration. It arrived methodically. Indictments followed. Court dates were set. Names were named. And Jessica remained dead. Officially, she no longer existed. No records. No sightings. Just a burned car on an icy road and a name folded into a news archive. In the silence that followed, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not triumph. Not relief. Space. For the first time since the collapse of her life, the fear receded. The danger moved past her, redirected toward those who had created it. Jessica had vanished so the truth could surface. And as the city reckoned with the fallout, one thing became clear. Justice, once set in motion, did not need her to be alive to unfold. Jessica waited longer than anyone expected before she returned. Weeks passed after the arrests, then months. The city moved on, consumed by hearings, headlines, and speculation. The fear that had once stalked her receded, replaced by a quiet certainty that the danger had burned itself out. When she finally stepped back into the world under her own name, it was without announcement. No press, no explanations, just a woman reclaiming the right to exist. She moved carefully at first, rebuilding routines piece by piece. The noise of Cleveland felt different now, less threatening, more distant. She rented a modest apartment near the lake, far from her old life, but no longer hidden. The silence she had once relied on as armor became something else entirely. Space to breathe. Evan stood beside her through it all. The reckoning between him and his father had been unavoidable. Victor Monroe's public confession had dismantled the walls that once separated them. After his arrest and release on bond, Victor requested to see his son, not as a businessman or a patriarch, but as a man stripped of pretense. They spoke privately, without intermediaries. There were no grand apologies, only hard truths exchanged at last. Victor acknowledged his crimes and the damage they caused. He admitted that he had lost sight of consequences long before he lost control. Evan listened without interrupting, his anger tempered by clarity. Reconciliation did not come easily, but it came honestly. Shortly afterward, Victor filed for divorce. The investigation uncovered evidence that his wife had manipulated finances, planted false accusations, and attempted to poison him to accelerate inheritance claims. The exposure was swift and decisive. She was charged, removed from his life as cleanly as possible, her influence finally severed. The city took note, not with sympathy, but with attention. Eric Whitman and Natalie Cross were not afforded the same measured quiet. Their case unfolded publicly, fueled by the evidence that had surfaced and the testimonies that followed. Fraud, conspiracy, industrial espionage. The charges stacked one upon another. Plea negotiations collapsed under the weight of proof. They were sentenced months later. Jessica did not attend the hearings. She learned the outcome through a brief news alert on her phone. She read it once, then set the device aside. There was no satisfaction in it, only closure. The future announced itself unexpectedly in the quietest of ways. Jessica had dismissed the early signs at first, unwilling to trust her body after what it had endured. When she finally went to the clinic, the confirmation left her sitting motionless in the exam room, hands folded tightly in her lap. She was pregnant. The doctor spoke, gently outlining precautions and next steps. Jessica nodded, listening carefully this time. When she told Evan, he didn't speak at first. He simply pulled her into a steady embrace, holding her as if the world had narrowed to that single moment. They married in a small ceremony not long afterward. No spectacle, no guest list filled with expectations, just a handful of people who had earned the right to witness it. The vows were simple, honest, rooted not in promises of perfection, but in commitment to truth. Victor Monroe attended quietly, keeping his distance, his presence respectful. As a gesture not of absolution, but of accountability, he finalized the purchase of the taxi company that had once employed Jessica. Frank Dalton had already fallen, his blackmail exposed, his illegal surveillance uncovered, his license revoked. The company was transferred into Jessica's name. She was stunned when Victor handed her the documents. "You know this business," he said simply, "and you know what it's like to lose control when power goes unchecked. That matters." Jessica accepted the responsibility with measured resolve. She didn't rebuild the company to erase the past, but to correct it. Policies changed. Transparency replaced secrecy. Drivers were treated as professionals, not liabilities. Trust became a foundation rather than an afterthought. Life did not transform overnight. It rarely did, but it grew steadier, more intentional. Jessica no longer defined herself by what had been taken from her. She defined herself by what remained and what she chose to build. The strength she carried now was quieter than before, less visible but far more durable. She understood something she hadn't before. Justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it unfolds in documents, in courtrooms, in decisions made far from applause. Survival, she learned, could become strength, not by hardening the heart, but by sharpening clarity. And dignity, preserved in silence when shouting would have changed nothing, was the most powerful revenge of all. As her life settled into a new rhythm, Jessica often reflected on the moments when restraint had protected her more than confrontation ever could, when waiting had achieved what force never would. For those listening to her story, she would offer this quiet invitation. Think about the times when silence shielded you, when patience altered the outcome, when holding your ground without explanation changed the course of your life. If this story stirred something in you, consider sharing your thoughts. Sometimes, in speaking carefully or choosing not to speak at all, we discover where our true strength has been waiting.